When I was young, I was sitting watching TV when one of our neighbours came round for a coffee. She was telling my mother about a girl who had been possessed. What disturbed me was how she was talking about the event. This wasn't like a story about something that was happening far away. She was talking about an event, like she was talking about someone breaking into her home. When my mother tried to calm her, she warned her not to name the thing she was talking about, but the name was said, and they both fell silent. So, what was this being? Why had it created so much fear? And did they all have the same power to possess? Welcome to the mysteries of mythology. Jinn. I'm going to be honest, I'm uncomfortable right now. That experience when I was young left a fear in me that never really went away. Just saying the name feels like I'm calling it, like calling Bloody Mary. So when so many of you asked in my ghoul video for a video about jinns, I put those fears aside and started researching. But first, I want to address the most debated part about the jinn. Is the jinn a genie? It's a fair question because whenever jinn are mentioned in English, someone almost always brings up the genie. And to be fair, that's what most people picture, a magical being trapped in a lamp granting wishes. But the answer is no, not really. The modern genie is a later version of the jinn, shaped through translation, retelling, and popular culture, until it became something quite different from the original idea. The confusion mostly comes from 1001 Nights, also known as Arabian Nights. But even that collection wasn't a single fixed book. It grew over time, pulling together stories from different regions and traditions. Some of the earliest material is often linked to a much older Persian collection called Hezar Afsan, which means 1,000 tales. That collection itself no longer exists, but it's thought to date back to somewhere between the 8th and the 10th centuries, long before the stories were gathered into what we now call the Arabian Nights. These stories were passed across cultures, translated, adapted and expanded long before they reached Europe. And when they finally did in the early 18th century, a French translator named Anton Galland used the word genie to describe certain supernatural beings in the stories. But a little known fact is that Anton Galland didn't just translate these stories. Like some of the storytellers before him, he also added to them. That includes some of the most famous ones like Ali Baba and Aladdin. But Galland didn't get those from an old written manuscript. He got them from a Syrian storyteller named Hannah Diab. Now, the English word genie comes from the French genie, which itself comes from the word genius. In Roman belief, a genius was a spirit associated with a person or place, not a wish granter, but more like a guiding presence. So when Galland translated these stories into French, he used the word genie for beings like jinn, probably because it was the closest familiar sounding word for a European audience. And from there, the image started to shift. Some of the supernatural beings in these stories were originally jinn, but the word genie was now being used instead. Over time, the versions shaped how audiences understood the whole idea. And to be fair, Disney's Aladdin is one of my favourite animated films. But in these stories, what's called a genie is usually a jinn. The lamp-living, wish-granting version most people know today came later. Which leads us to the next question. What were the original jinn like? The word jinn comes from Arabic and means to hide or to conceal, and that's a pretty good summary of who they are. Jinn weren't just supernatural beings, they were hidden ones. They were believed to exist in the same world as us, but just out of sight. Not in another realm, but close, just unseen. Creepy moment, but there might be one in the room with you right now. Now, I want to make it clear, not all jinn are considered evil. In Islamic belief, jinn are created from God from what's described as smokeless fire, before humans were created from clay. Like humans, they were believed to have free will. They could choose, they could believe or reject belief. They could act with intention, which means they weren't all the same. Some were thought to be harmless, some were indifferent, and some were believed to be genuinely dangerous. But what really stands out is how similar they were said to be with us. They lived in communities, they had families, they married, had children and formed societies of their own. They made choices, had emotions, and were held responsible for their actions. They were also believed to live long lives, sometimes for longer than humans, and like humans they could eat, drink, fall ill, and eventually die. So in a strange way they weren't completely alien. They were more like a hidden population, existing alongside humanity but separated by something you couldn't see. And people believed, and still believe, this to be true. There were places where Jinn were believed to dwell: ruins, caves, deserts, crossroads, abandoned buildings, places that felt empty but not entirely. And in some traditions, before entering those places, people would announce themselves, just in case. I know in the Turkish community they say destur, meaning permission, as a way of acknowledging that they might not be alone. Not because they knew something was there, but because they didn't want to take the risk. Because the fear wasn't just that Jinn existed, it was that they might be nearby, and that even if you couldn't see them, they might be aware of you. People weren't cautious of Jinn only because of what they were cautious because of what they could do. Because in many traditions, Jinn were not distant beings who kept to their own world. They were believed to interfere in human life, sometimes subtly, sometimes not. They could be a whisper, they could mislead, they could disturb a person's thoughts, influence their emotions, or push them towards anger, fear, or even confusion. And in the most frightening accounts, they could possess. Now that didn't always mean the dramatic version people imagine today. In many cases, the fear was more gradual than that. A person might become withdrawn or aggressive or start behaving in ways that felt completely unlike themselves. They weren't treated as having a medical or psychological problem. People believed it was the work of Jinn. In fact, the Arabic word majnun comes from meaning something like jinn struck or possessed by a jinn. It was used to describe someone as if they were possessed or driven mad. Some jinn were also believed to form attachments to people. The qareen, for example, was often described as a constant companion, one that stayed close and whispered towards temptation or error, testing the person's integrity. Jinn were also said to appear in dreams, to haunt places, to imitate voices, or to take the form of animals. Snakes and black dogs are often mentioned in some traditions. In some Middle Eastern traditions, even sleep paralysis was linked to a jinn, sometimes called al-jathum, believed to sit on the chest of a person and hold them in place while they were unable to move. Some poets, soothsayers, and mystics were believed to have contact with unseen beings who fed them words, visions, or ideas. So the jinn were not always associated only with harm. Some were believed to help, but the uncertainty meant you didn't always know the kind of being you were dealing with. So what were the different types of jinn? This is where things get a little bit complicated. Because in Arabic and Islamic tradition, jinn weren't always divided into one single fixed way. Different writers, regions, and periods used different names, and sometimes the same term could shift in meaning depending on the source. And just to be clear, jinn is the plural, the singular is genie, which makes it even more evident where we get the Western word genie. A female singular form, jinniyah, is also sometimes used. Now these categories don't form a perfectly neat system. They aren't species in the modern sense. Some names describe where the being lives, some describes its nature or behavior, and some belong more to folklore than to religious texts. But even so, certain types appear again and again, and they help us understand how people saw this hidden world. One of the broadest terms is Jinn. This is often understood as one of the older categories of jinn, and it's sometimes linked to beings of the desert, the wilderness, and places beyond settled human life. It refers to an older, more primal kind of being tied to the time before humanity, almost like an ancient nature spirit. In some versions, the Jinn was a single jinn, the first created from smokeless fire. Then there are the Amar. These are jinn said to dwell in houses, buildings, or places that humans also live in or pass through. They're not always described as openly hostile, but they reflect an important idea in jinn belief, that the spaces people move through are not thought to belong to humans alone. Another important type is the qareen, which I touched on earlier. The qareen is usually described as a companion spirit, one attached to a person. In some traditions, every person was believed to have one. Some sources also mention lesser-known categories like tabi and the hin. These are not always clearly defined, but they're sometimes described as more primitive or animal-like jinn. Then there is the ifrit. The ifrit is probably one of the most well-known types of jinn, especially in later folklore and literature. It's usually presented as powerful, forceful, and difficult to control. In some traditions, ifrits are said to have been bound or commanded by figures like King Solomon, who was believed to have authority over certain jinn. But outside of those rare cases, they're generally seen as dangerous and strong-willed beings. Over time, the ifrit became one of the most recognizable jinn types in storytelling. Another name that appears often is marid. The marid is usually presented as proud, powerful, and defiant. In later folklore and fantasy, it became one of the best-known jinn types, and it's also helped shape some of the later ideas that fed into the Western image of the genie. Then there is the Scylla. The Scylla appears mainly in folklore and is often described as a shape-shifting female jinn. In some stories, she can appear in human form, which makes her one of the more deceptive figures in the tradition. She's not always included in the same list as other types, but she appears often enough in later lore to deserve a mention. Then there is the ghoul. The ghoul belongs to more Arabic folklore, but it often overlaps with the wider world of jinn. It's associated with lonely places, ruins, graveyards, and the wilderness, and over time it became one of the most feared figures connected to the unseen world. And I've actually covered the ghoul in much more detail in my video on ghouls, so if you want the full folklore around that figure, you can watch that after this. And finally, there are the shayatin. These are the devils, the openly malicious beings associated with rebellion, corruption, and spiritual danger. The singular is shaitan, and the term is closely linked to Satan. In many traditions, the shayatin represent the most hostile end of the jinn world. There are other names as well. Some sources mention stranger beings like the shik and the naznaz. These are often described as incomplete or distorted forms, sometimes said to have half a body moving in unnatural ways like hopping. But not every source uses these terms in the same way, and not all of them belong to the core or early jinn belief. So the important thing is not to know every category. It's to understand that when people spoke about jinn, they weren't always talking about one single kind of being. They were speaking about a whole hidden population with different roles, different traits, and different places in the community. But there was one that was different. There was one jinn who changed the direction of the tradition. Up to this point, jinn can seem varied. Some were harmful, some were not. But one figure stands out when it comes to rebellion. In the Quranic story of Adam's creation, God commanded the angels to bow before Adam. They obeyed, but Iblis, who was among them, refused. He said that he was better than Adam. Adam was made from clay, he was made from fire. In his own eyes, that made him superior. After refusing to bow, Iblis is cast out. But before leaving, he asked to be permitted to live until the day of judgment, and that request is granted. He then vows to mislead human beings, to approach them from different directions, to whisper, to tempt, and to lead them away from the right path. In Islamic tradition, that refusal becomes one of the most defining moments in the moral history of the unseen world. Iblis becomes the model of conscious rebellion against God, and the enemy of human beings from that point forward. I've gone into some depth about the jinn, but there's so much more, and much of it is strongly disputed. Going back to the start of this video, I can see why my neighbour was so afraid. Jinn didn't just live in stories. People spoke about them as if they lived nearby, close enough that even saying their name felt dangerous. So what do you think of the Jinn?